to use a personal example from my interactions with Bella, she's been a great teacher. She's my current dog companion. She's cranky and she bites people, including me, and wants to be left alone as much as she wants to interact and doesn't want to obey human commands and so forth. And she has really invited me to think more carefully about what it means to interact with another being. And that, I had this whole set of expectations about what a good dog is. And she just blew that out of the water. And she's a good dog. Every dog is a good dog. That's the thing. And we just have to, it's our own perceptions and expectations of them that need to shift so that we embrace who they are, not who we think they ought to be. And I think that goes for our interactions with other humans in our lives too. We have a lot of expectations about who we think people ought to be, and we need to love them for who they are.
Hi, this is Frank Schaeffer, and you are watching and or listening to my podcast, In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer. And today we're live on Facebook. This will then go to YouTube and all the places podcasts go to, Substack, and all the rest of this. I'm in a weird position today because I interview a lot of authors, and today I'm interviewing someone that I admire so much, and I like her writing so much that I am sort of gobsmacked, starstruck, because to me, Dr. Jessica Pierce is a hero. She kind of stands for everything you hope the human race will become someday by writing about animals. And that's sort of weird, but if you judge someone by how they treat others, I think another good judge is how we treat what we've been given here in this world. And a good interface between human behavior and ethics, I think, is what Jessica Pierce writes about. And that is what we do with animals. And I have been reading her online and just finished rereading a book of hers, Spot Run, The Ethics of Keeping Pets. And I have a lot of quotes from that I'll be talking about today and asking her about. But anyway, first of all, Jessica, is it okay to call you Jessica and not Dr. Pierce? Because you're a doctor.
Of course, I prefer that.
And I don't want to be over casual. But let me just first say that having just read that book and an essay you wrote for, is it the website is Aeon? Am I saying it right?
Mm-hmm.
Aeon.
Eon. I think Eon. It depends on where you live in the world.
Yeah, and I ran into your stuff online like that, then tracked down your books, then looked them over, then read Run, Spot, Run. And I'm going to start in a weird place. Some of that book was hard to read in the sense that human behavior to animals is so difficult to digest. It's kind of like reading about the abuse of children or something when it gets into some people's sexual practices, the way animals are abused. You're taking the course on how to euthanize an animal and bursting into tears. There were parts of your book where I felt like I was in a novel where it was hard to finish a chapter because I was so involved. And on a very personal level, in the sense that aside from my wife, my children and grandchildren, the person on this earth who means most to me right now is Zip, my little dog, who's a rescue. I love what you write about the closest to animals. You quote some people who think it's unethical to even have an animal at all, and you go to bat for those of us like me whose lives have been so healed by my relationship with the dogs that I've had, and Zip in particular, and one before that. I was glad you did that because it's a strange relationship to have with an animal that you love in the same way almost you love a human being. And yet, when I step on Zip's paw by mistake and apologize to him, and he looks at me as in, why did you do that? And I want to tell him, look, this was a mistake. And that's where it gets very poignant, because you love the animal the way you love a person, but you run into barriers of communication. That's the longest and weirdest introduction I've ever done for a guest. But as I say, I'm nervous because I'm starstruck. do you want to help me get through this interview by telling me what you stand for and who you are in terms of all your writing on the treatment of animals? And you're an ethicist and a psychologist as well, I believe. I just think you're an amazing person, and I want to dive into your work wholesale and sort of take spot, run spot. And then also you have a new book coming out in September. There's a lot to talk about.
Yes, there is a lot to talk about. So why do I do what I do? So I started life as, I didn't start life as a bioethicist. That would be a strange thing to be born as. I definitely started my life as an animal lover, although, well, we can talk about that phrase later. I've been thinking a lot about what it means to call yourself an animal lover or an animal person, because I think it means different things to different people. To me, it means I treat animals as I would like to be treated myself, as kind of golden rule. I started my professional life in the context of a human medical center. I was teaching medical ethics to students, and I have to say it was soul-sucking. And one of the most soul-sucking experiences I had at the medical center was being a member of the IACUC, which is the Institutional Animal Care and Use Committee, which is the committee that oversees the use of animals in research protocols and basically rubber stamps research involving animal subjects that goes on in the university. And it was a really interesting experience that went on for 2 years. One of the worst, most painful experiences of my life for various reasons. But it really got me thinking about human-animal relationships. And it also made me acutely aware that I mean, although a lot of what I write about, as you mentioned in your introduction, is kind of hard stuff, things that we humans do to animals that we should not do. I mean, that's really just horrific. And although I don't think you can really write or talk about animals without getting into that, I really wanted to focus on things that make me happy. That's companion animals, the animals that I live with, and also the animals that I interact with out in nature. This is a long-winded introduction on my part.
Well, one of the parts of the book that I like, and I'm sorry if I confused the book, which I'll call up here because I've got all your quotes ready to go, and I'll go through some and ask you about them. But with page numbers and everything, I got serious on this. But I love the fact that you also talked about the interface of the animals that you have had, and your children, and your life, because I just found that so refreshing. There are very few people who come at things from an academic perspective that give you reasons on their human connections to trust them. You finish their book and you don't know anything about them. They could be serial killers for all you know.
Yeah.
They've just got a lot of footnotes. And one thing I loved about Spot, Run, Spot, and your writing in general, is I got to know you through that. And that must be a decision at some point, because I think it's University of Chicago Press, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Well,
Yes.
when you get up into the University of Chicago Press echelons, you're expected to be a serious person. And I don't know if you ever had a fight with the editors about it, but I read a lot of academic books, and you write like a human being. And therefore I connect to the animals you're writing about because I trust you.
That I really appreciate you saying that. And it's actually, it was a professional risk to write from the first person. I will say Chicago was 100% behind it, because it's, I think there's been an increasing trend in the field of ethics to recognize that you can't take the the subject, the I, out of your perspective. I mean, that's the reason you come to certain conclusions about what's good or bad in the world, is because of the kind of person you are and the kind of experiences you've had. And so our ethical lives are embedded in who we are. And I think especially with animals, what I really didn't want to do was be judgmental and self-righteous and say, here's the right way to be toward animals. And I'm an expert. And so this is what I'm going to tell you, because from my experience, it's really messy. It's super ambiguous. And I mean, in a way, all of the books I've written are me trying to work out how to do things better. The subtitle of my book that's coming out in September is How to Be a Better Human. And that's really the core of my work, how to be a better human for the animals in our lives.
The title of the book, by the way, is Who's a Dog and How to Be a Better Human. Do I have that right?
Who's a Good Dog?
Who's a Good Dog? I mean, not Who's a Dog.
Yeah.
Who's a Good Dog and I should put my glasses on. I'm reading the notes section here. Who's a Good Dog and How to Be a Better Human. I like that title, and I'll look forward to reading that. And we can come back in September and talk about it again. But in the meantime, it seems to me that in making that choice to give us a glimpse of your own humanity and your relationship with your family, and some stories about, some of the pets in your household over the years, and at the same time challenging your reader to really look again at our relationship with everything around us, not just pets and animals and dogs and cats and this kind of thing. I've been reading other people, for instance, Melanie Kaplan, who writes for the Washington Post and New York Times.
Yes.
And has this beagle that she's rescued. And I've been following her and other people. And then the Coppingers and their research, and Horowitz and all these other people who talk about dogs and history and everything and so forth. I've gotten to know you better than any of them. And I know I already mentioned this, but I think that it's so important for people to realize who might come to your book. And I would suggest everybody literally buys, just as a good read, no matter what your interests are, Jessica Pierce's books, and Run Spot Run is a terrific book. It's just a fabulous book. And I'm sure I love the title of the new book, and I'm so anxious to read it. But my question to you is on a daily basis, how have you coped with the fact that as a human being who loves her children and has experienced life as someone sensitive, I'm often think these same things when I talk to some of my journalist friends who were sent off to war zones. Some of your chapters on the abuse of animals are hard to read, but at the same time, as you say, necessary. But the overall tone of the book, I not only found enlightening, but it gave me some hope in the sense that you have this sensitivity. And I look at younger people, some of the more woke generation, and people like the musician Moby, who's all about animal rights and who I interviewed on this podcast of mine and who I've gotten to know a little bit. There are voices out there that it seems that there is, I won't call it a trend, but there's a direction now where what you're saying and the kind of things you're saying, even if it's from other people, are being taken seriously by the younger people than my generation, I'm 70 years old, would have taken them. So are you kind of at the right time in the right place to bring your message?
I think so. I hope so. Because we really do, we do need to do better. I think it's critical to the animals with whom we share the planet, and also critical to our own well-being and survival. And, I do think, I was surprised. So Run Spot Run, for the 99.9% of your readers who haven't read it, is what it does is question the whole practice of pet keeping. And the reason I wanted to look at that was, well, first of all, because I personally started to get more and more uncomfortable with the practice of pet keeping. And as a mother of a child who loved animals, we had every kind of pet you could imagine, with the exception of a tiger. So and you think, I'm an animal lover. That means that I love pet keeping. And that seems to be the formulation that people take for granted. And I don't think that's the right formulation. It turned out not to be for me. In fact, pet keeping really made me think, wow, I'm not loving animals by doing this. I'm keeping animals in cages. I'm not equipped to provide them the kind of life that they deserve. I'm keeping an animal captive for my entertainment is really cruel.
Yeah.
So I think I think the younger generation is open to self-reflection, and may, I hope, think about human animal relations in a different way.
Yeah, let me just reintroduce my guest. This is Frank Schaeffer, in conversation with Frank Schaeffer, and Dr. Jessica Pierce is a bioethicist and a writer of many books and articles that I have been following closely. And we're talking quite a bit about Run, Spot, Run, the ethics of keeping pets. I want to go to something that was of interest to me in the book, and this is not a rhetorical question, but it seems to me, and I know this is heavily loaded because I have this dog Zip that lives with me and our family, but it seems to me that the fact that dogs co-evolved with human beings in the sense that they are dependent upon our refuse and our waste, and they began to evolve, whether you think they all came from wolves or not, or like the Coppingers who would say that perhaps there's other species, that have interbred with this line. You look at the village dog population of the world, they're all 30 to 40 pounds. They all look the same. They hang around humans. Humans sort of adopt them. They adopt humans. But do you think that dogs are an exception to not the rule? You're not making rules, but it seems that since dogs co-evolved with humans, in what I call the survival of the friendliest paradigm, of the most cooperative, and tend, for instance, to comfort each other in consolation after a dog loses a fight with another fight. Maybe I'm just making too much of a case for myself here, but it just seems to me that since dogs adopt humans everywhere dogs appear in the quote wild, which they never do because they're always near human habitation, that maybe, just maybe, you're going to let me off the hook a little bit for my relationship with Zip, because Zip is not a snake in a glass box. Zip is not a solitary goldfish in a thing. Zip wants to be with me. If Zip was a village dog eating the refuse off the Mexico City dump, and I was around and started being closer to him, it's perfectly conceivable he would come and live with me in the same way my dog Zip lives with me, that I got from a rescue a shelter, and so forth. Am I just being wishful here because I don't want you to tell me I can't live with my dog Zip?
No, I think there are really good reasons to think that there's something unique about the human dog relationship. And, in Run, Spot, Run, the way I articulated the ethics of living with pets or companion animals, I think I'm not sure a snake can be, people would argue with me over this, but maybe not as a companion in the same way a dog can, at least from the animal's perspective.
Yeah.
That some of the factors that go into deciding whether what you're doing with or toward an animal is ethical is domestication. Is the animal domesticated or wild? And domesticated animals, you got a green light for now, because they have evolved in the company of humans, are comfortable in human dominated environments.
Yeah.
And we can live with them in ways that don't require intensive captivity. So you can live with your dog in a way such that your dog doesn't have to live behind bars.
Yeah, yesterday Zip had to have a tooth taken out and a general anesthesia and had his teeth cleaned. He's about six years old, going on 7 years old. And I've had numerous serious surgeries, like an anterior discectomy on my spine that could have killed me. I was
Ouch.
less worried going under anesthesia at Massachusetts General Hospital 19 years ago for that surgery than I was yesterday when he's
Yeah.
going in for a 1-hour procedure. And I'm not making this up. And I'm not a touchy-feely person in the sense that, like, I'm fairly rational about things. I was terrified. I pray sometimes. I was praying for Zip at the same time. I'm also describe myself as an atheist who believes in God, not knowing whether I'm being heard. My emotional involvement was total with him. But the end of this story on the domestication side, tails don't lie. The tail of dog wags. Zip is half asleep with anesthesia, and the vet walks by saying, look, he's doing well, and no tail wag. And I showed my face and threw eyes looking like this at me because he's still just coming out. His
Yeah.
tail, which normally is very brisk and arched over his back, just goes,
Oh.
like he's waving to me. And I welled up. Okay, I've been like you, a parent of young children. This is years ago now. I have 5 grandchildren now. And mea culpa, before I thought about any of this, guinea pigs, mice, rats, all to the slaughter, frogs in glass jars, fish. We basically murdered animals, not through neglect. We were good pet keepers.
Yeah.
But I look back and it was like, what was all that about? But my relationship with Zip is totally different.
Yeah.
Zip and I go to sleep with Zip's head on my shoulder. Zip doesn't want to be anywhere I'm not. Right now, he's asleep in Jeannie's bed, my wife of 53 years. We got pregnant 17 and 18. We've been together a long time because he needs comforting, and he's under her covers on the hot pad that he likes to be on, being warm.
Oh,
this
cute.
is all his
Yeah.
choice. He followed her up there. Zip's not trying to escape anywhere. Zip would be heartbroken if suddenly I said, okay, go be a wild dog now. And it's not sentiment to say he's family. He is. My granddaughter came over, especially yesterday afternoon, to comfort him post-surgery. This is not the same sort of thing as you describe in your book of a goldfish in a glass bowl or a snake or something like that. And the reading I've done on dogs, evolving, your books as well, I just think that from my point of view, people say, well, you're supposed to say, what would Jesus do when it comes to how you treat a human being? My first question is, what would a dog do? And I'm not being facetious.
Yeah.
Because dogs don't do the terrible things we do, not even to each other.
Right.
That's a long ramble, but I just want you to react to it a little
Well,
bit.
it's a good demonstration of the human dog bond at its finest. And, I think, so I would say 2 things. One is that, I do think that humans and dogs can live together in ways that are mutually beneficial and where everybody's needs are being met.
Yeah.
So yes, we can live ethically with dogs. And point 2 is that it's not super easy. And that, I think there's a common assumption that pet dogs are like, there's no problem there because they're all pampered and they're, eating out, they get fed twice a day and all they have to do is sleep and catch a Frisbee if they feel like it. And maybe, lick us on the nose now and then. And what I really want people to think about is, are you providing, your dog is captive in a certain way.
Yeah, absolutely.
And they have to be in the US legally. You're not allowed to let your dog just roam around in a way that your dog might like to do. So your dog lives under conditions of captivity. What can you do to compensate and give your dog the very best possible life? And thinking about your dog's daily experiences from your dog's point of view and not from your point of view. So let's take food for an example. You think, well, my dog is just doing great because he doesn't have to work for food. I just provide it in a bowl. Maybe it's kibble, maybe it's some home cooked meal that you spent more time creating than you spent on your own dinner. That's, in a way, that's good. And in a way, that's not good because dogs have motivational needs related to feeding behavior. They're canids. So they are motivated to find their own food, to forage, to stalk, to dig, bury, all, chew. There are all sorts of things that dogs are going to want to do and actually need to do related to feeding that just giving them a bowl of kibble won't satisfy. So making sure that your dog has opportunities to chew on stuff and stuff that you're not going to scold your dog for chewing on, or, and this might, I'm not sure how you'd react to this, but when I take my dog Bella out for walks, I actually do let her just forage for herself. She really likes to do that. And she finds stuff that, like goose poop is one of her very favorite little snacks to find. Deer poop is pretty, that's also on the menu. And some people get really upset about this and, oh, that's so gross. And I don't let my dog touch anything out in the world. I'm like, well, that's how dogs evolved. And she gets a lot of pleasure out of seeking these things out. I mean, sometimes it's, French fry that's squished into the sidewalk. But just letting your dog be a dog, I guess, is the basic message. And that goes for, feeding behavior, interactions with other dogs, sniffing when you're out on a walk, letting your dog make choices and have agency. That's something I kind of push on a lot in my writings, is just letting dogs be dogs and make dog choices.
I don't know if you've run across, I think it's The Secret Life of Dogs by Elizabeth Marshall Thomas.
Yes,
she also wrote this fabulous book. One of my favorite books of hers is The Old Way, which is about her as a kid with her parents in Africa, with the in the Kalahari, with the Bushmen there in the desert. She let her dogs in Cambridge, Massachusetts. She had one that would go off, and if it got lost after roaming free and illegally, because you're not supposed to do this, it would just park itself on somebody's door stoop and expect them to read its tag, call her, and she would come and get them.
That's great.
But so she went the whole thing, and she writes about following him surreptitiously to see where he went. So Elizabeth Marshall Thomas did what you're talking about, and a book came out of it, and it's a good book to read. I feel the same way, and I try to replicate, and again, imperfectly, but it's not the only imperfect part of my life. My wife and I have been together 53 years. It has not all been perfect, and we love each other, and we're still together, but I do some writing about that journey. And it's the same with a dog. You don't have a perfect relationship. You have the relationship you've got. In my case, I have a long dog run a couple hundred feet out with and we have a lot of deer around, which you'd like to follow into the forest. But on that run, he's digging up all sorts of noxious things and doing things and burying stuff, and comes in smelling funny and all the rest of it. And I let him alone on that and suffer the ticks that I have to get off of him afterwards after a good ramble. Took him for a sniffy walk this morning, same kind of thing. What you're saying completely is wonderful. I want to just change the subject a little bit to dog breeding here. When I see a lot of stuff about training dogs and problem dogs and so on, if you look at the history of dog breeding, which is really a 19th century eugenics phenomenon, and the breeders, like the American Kennel Club, they want to talk about these ancient breeds. Bullshit. There were some Chinese who did some stuff once in the Ming Dynasty. There were some people here and there, but it's interesting that if dogs aren't bred and they just start mating, pretty soon you've got a village dog again, just a regular 30 to 40 pound dog, short hair, tail curled up over the back, semi-floppy ear. There is such a thing as a dog, and it's not this teacup freak show or furious, huge dog bred for viciousness. Let's just go there. Let's talk about dog breeding, kennel clubs, dog shows, what this has done to the dog species, and how all these dogs with short muzzles, unable to breathe, hip dysplasia. This is not what, my dog is a mix of Dachshund, Jack Russell, something, pretty Zip is pretty straight dog, not a village dog, but on the way to being back to a regular old dog. Talk about that, because the Kennel Club is always doing its thing, and plummy accents, commentators with British accents telling you how this is also great. British royal family, shooting everything in sight, dog breeding, dog shows. There's a whole world there that you sort of take on, and I want to go there in this interview.
Okay, let's go there. And yeah, I'll start with a controversial statement, which is I'd like to see Westminster go. I'd like to see the Kennel Club go, and I'd like to see dog breeding as a human hobby go. And the reason is because I think none of those are good for dogs.
Right.
They're bad for dogs.
Yes.
And we can go into the various reasons why. One of which I'll mention is just that they reinforce for consumers, and I really don't like that word in relation to dogs and people, but that's the language that is used by the industry, that consumers of dogs think that what matters is how a dog looks. These aesthetic features, often the features that are considered cute by us are features that are actually really damaging for dogs. And, if you look back at the history of humans living with dogs, there's been selective breeding for at least 1,000 years. There's some archaeological evidence. It's really interesting of people off the coast of Siberia doing what appears to be selective breeding for dogs who were good at pulling sleds. But it wasn't the kind of breeding that we have now. It was, you maybe pick the dogs who are the best sled pullers or the most physically robust, and you encourage them to reproduce together. And over time, you have better and better and better sled pullers, or dogs who are more adapted to cold, or so forth. The functionality of the dogs, the physical health, and the role that the dogs were helping fulfill in their partnership with humans, their role as working dogs, was the goal of our intervention into their breeding lives. It's a totally different thing now. And I mean, every year when Westminster comes around, it just makes me sad. And it bothers me. I read the New York Times. That's kind of my go-to newspaper, but they insist on providing this extensive coverage of Westminster it's not critical at all. It's just, oh my God, look at these cute dogs. And every single picture that you look at of these dogs, they look miserable. I actually went through looking for a picture of a dog that I would consider to look happy or relaxed, and I couldn't find any. And so why are we doing this poofing and perfuming and prancing around? It's money driven and status driven. And I mean, do you want me to go into the flat-faced dogs, or you want to?
Yeah, no, I want you to roll with this. Take it.
Yeah, I obviously get very excited about this issue because it makes me really upset. So there have been some trends in dog acquisition behavior. That's language that psychologists and economists use to talk about, what drives people to acquire and be interested in certain kinds of dogs over others. And what's been driving dog acquisition practices, especially lately, is cuteness. There's a lot of interest in cute images on social media. So Instagram, their dogs have Instagram accounts with millions of followers. A lot of these dogs are what are called brachycephalic breeds, which are basically breeds they're dogs who've been bred to have an extremely foreshortened skull. And breeders will push and push and push the extremeness of this flat-facedness or smushedness until you get dogs like the French Bulldog, which last year was the most popular dog in the United States. They are so cute. They're very cute, but when I look at them, I just see suffering. They cannot breathe. That's the main thing that I see and this snuffling sound that's really characteristic of these flat-faced breeds, the boxers and the French Bulldogs and the pugs, that everybody says, oh, that's so cute. Listen to them snuffle. It's actually respiratory distress. It is a dog whose skull morphology is not good for breathing. And we've really, we've normalized suffering in these dogs to the extent that we don't even really see it anymore. There have been some really interesting studies in the veterinary literature on, people with, for example, one study that I always come back to in my writing because it's so striking to me, was a study of clients who were with their dogs at a veterinary clinic for brachycephalic obstructive airway syndrome, which that should tell you something, that there is an entire syndrome that is specific to these dogs that's caused by this morphology. And of the people whose dogs had this brachycephalic obstructive airway syndrome, half said, oh, my dog is fine. My dog doesn't have any breathing problems. So we just don't notice that we don't see it as a problem. And, the same thing happens with, often you'll see pictures of pugs in what veterinarians would call a lazy sit, which is where the butt's not under the legs, but it's kind of off to the side. And my dog Bella sits like that. She sits in a lazy sit because she's 12 and she's had a cruciate ligament tear, a kneecap dislocation, and she has severe arthritis in both of her hips. That's why she sits like that, because it's really painful to sit in a normal sit. And so when you see a pug sitting in a lazy sit, it's not cute. It's a pain behavior. And I wish people would see it for that.
My question is, there's so many people out there who love their dogs as you and I do. Take my little dog Zip here. Thank God he doesn't have the things you're talking about, because he's far enough away from some eugenic nightmare breed of cuteness to be a real dog, and a nice long muzzle and good eyes and can trot along. His legs are a little shorter than his village dog cousins, but that's about it. But, there's a lot of people who would be listening to this who, for instance, have a dog that they've rescued who has some of these traits, and they're doing the best they can. But then there are, of course, the breeders themselves, not just who are dog breeding, but who are just selling these from puppy farms to pet stores and so forth. There's a whole industry that would have to be shut down. And then, of course, there's the kennel clubs that we've got a new breed, and this new breed has this long, shaggy stuff over its face. It can't see anything. You'll never find a tick because the natural dog length of fur is short, because otherwise they could never groom themselves. And it's all just, like you say, the New York Times glorifies it. NPR supposedly has this high ethical standard. You listen to NPR reports on the Kennel Club and the dog shows, and okay, this is hyperbolic, but I'm reminded of normalizing, a slave market or something. And like there were great choices on the stand today. I bought a whole family.
Yeah.
And I think 100 years from now, if we ever improve in anything, we're going to look back on the breeding cycle of dogs the way we look at the other huge ethical lapses of bear baiting, dog fighting, all these things that we now think are, have been pushed to an illegal realm. They're still happening because human beings are awful, but they're not happening with all of us saying, oh yeah, that's fine. I went to I watched dog fight last week and they tore each other apart and it was so much fun. We don't do that. So there has been some ethical change between now and Shakespeare's London on treatment of what we call pets, but it just seems to me that a huge blind spot is the whole thing you're talking about. So let me just talk practically for a minute. And what do you think? One of the things that I've got a quote from is your list of things. You've got a wonderful list of, in the best of all worlds, I forget if it's 20 things on the list that would happen. I have it here, but I'm going to do better than read it to you. I'm going to ask you to just go through some of that list and then go back to this idea of breeding and dog shows and speak practically about what can be done to start changing our perception.
Okay, well, you might have to read the list because I don't remember what I said.
While you talk, I'm going to look. Now, I want you to just start talking me through this. Go ahead and let me look at this while you talk.
Yeah, and I think a point that you made just a moment ago is worth really coming back to and emphasizing, which is the people who live with the dogs, even that I was talking about, these flat-faced dogs.
Yeah.
Often they are the best companions, the best caregivers. It's not, so I don't want to cast aspersions on dog guardians necessarily, because often people who have these dogs with significant caregiving needs are more attentive, more attached, more in love with their dogs, and really are doing the best they can. So it really, you could say, well, they shouldn't have gotten that kind of dog in the first place. And often the dogs are rescues. And I can totally understand the mentality, because I've been there. You look at a dog at a shelter or even at a breeder and say, oh my God, I feel so bad for this dog. I want to rescue this dog. And that's really hard to resist. So I do think it's breeders who really need to, they need to step up their game and either quit breeding dogs altogether, which might be my number one choice, but number two, to breed ethically, so that what you are focused on is the vitality, the physical functioning and mental well-being of dogs. I would like to see there be no commercial breeders whatsoever, because I think, if money is getting mixed in with this and the motivation of making a profit, ethics almost always goes out the window. That's a pretty cynical thing to say, but you might agree with me. I'm not sure.
I do agree with you.
Yeah. And I think that happens with our dogs. And the fact that dogs are commodities, that they're things that are bought and sold and valued with a price tag, is going to create ethical problems sort of no matter what. So I guess in an ideal world, it'd be nice if dogs were no longer commodities, but just companions. And if you want a dog, you adopt a dog who needs a home, who's in a shelter or a rescue, or a dog who happens to show up in your doorstep and say, that looks like a nice cozy bed that I would like to share.
Right. One of the things you've got in Run Spot Run, the ethics of keeping pets, this is page 210 to 212. You got quite a few lists in here, but I'll just sort of run through this. The rights of pet owners are, for the time being, well protected. There are ways within our current milieu to also improve the protections offered companion animals themselves. Are there ways? You're asking a question. All of the following have been proposed as incremental changes that would offer increased protections: licensing requirements for all pet owners, laws limiting or prohibiting the sale of live animals, laws regulating international and interstate shipping of live animals, a federal prohibition on the sale of crush films, which I hate to go into what that is, but that's just, by the time you get here in the book, you know what that is. In particular, and animal pornography in general, state laws making sexual assault of an animal punishable, not limited to sexual assaults that are fatal or cause severe injury, better and more frequent inspections of breeding facilities, better and more frequent inspections of animal wholesale facilities, greater transparency in the pet industry, such as perhaps identifying the sourcing of animals for the sale, greater transparency in the shelter industry, state laws requiring at least 8 hours of training for anyone performing euthanasia, and so forth and so on. And, you know, basically what you're talking about is trying to bring some laws in that may sound a little far-fetched to people now, but then roll it back to any period of history. You know, in Europe in the 14th century, they used to race horses around the town square, but on another Sunday in summer, they raced Jews. And somebody would ride a Jew for the amusement of the rest of the population. And at some point, someone said, "What's this? Let's stop it." So there has been no ethical progress until someone like my guest, Jessica Pierce, who writes about this, comes along and says, why are we doing this? Instead of just, oh, how cute the latest dog show is in New York City that the Times is covering as if it's a society wedding. And you're asking, well, what the hell's going on here? These dogs aren't happy. And then, of course, you know, so I don't know, you know, on the, does history arc towards justice? If it does, then we're going to start treating these animals better across the board, including this sort of weird breeding of dogs that comes out of a eugenics movement that was itself completely discredited in the 1930s and 40s, where it hit its hypothesis in the Holocaust when it came to human breeding, as it were. Or
and I think that the fact that there are connections, as you're suggesting, between the idea of racial purity as it relates to humans and racial purity as it relates to dogs. And there are a lot of interconnections there that are worth teasing out and becoming aware of, because, I mean, this is a slightly different point, but our history with dogs is not universally beautiful and bright. There's a lot of darkness to it in how we have treated dogs and how we've used dogs to treat each other. And one thing that often surprises people when I say it is that dogs and other pet animals are actually have far fewer legal protections than any other animal that's used in the various venues in which we use animals. So a pet animal is actually less well protected than a pig in a slaughterhouse or a rat in a laboratory. And that's shocking to people, but it's true. And one of the things about pet keeping that is, well, two things. One is that's difficult ethically. It's private. It takes place in the privacy of our homes. So there's nobody really watching out for the well-being of companion animals. We can, in the privacy of our homes, do whatever we want. In the setting of a slaughterhouse or a research laboratory, the people who are handling the animals have training. You might say it's not enough training or it's not the right kind of training, but they have training. They have training in animal behavior, in how to recognize signs of pain and distress. And anybody can buy a dog or another pet animal who wants to and can know absolutely nothing about what a pain behavior might look like in a dog, how to recognize it, what to do about it. So I would venture to say that the welfare of dogs and companion animals in general is at far greater risk than the welfare of animals in other venues that have gotten more ethical attention.
Yeah, and in some of the things you talk about in terms of the abuse of animals in your book, this becomes, horribly evident. When it comes to this kind of weird tie-in with the eugenics movement, it was interesting to me. that you've talked about, and I'm sorry if I'm confusing one of your articles with the book. I have the quotes as I just read from, but the breeding, the dog show breeding mentality of sort of getting these eugenically pure breeds as opposed to those mutts. They rounding all the mutts up in New York City at one point and having public drownings of them.
Yeah.
Because we're getting rid of the mutts. And then, unlike a fine bred dog, and that mentality still continues with the kennel clubs. They're not drowning the mutts, but their idea is, these are the super dogs. And what's this little animal zip mixture of all these things? And of course, without being too hysterical about it, the language is identical to the racism we see in our country and to the eugenics movement in Nazi Germany. Let's just go there. I don't, and one of the things that you point out in your book, and I have the quote, but I'm not going to waste the time going to it because you can talk about this, is the correlation in all the psychological studies that have been done between animal and child abuse and animal and spousal abuse. Someone that is going to be cruel to an animal, or a culture that accepts this cruelty, is also a culture that accepts women wandering around with a black eye because their husband punched them. And it's all linked. So you can't say, well, these are, let's take the hardest view that isn't mine, and it certainly isn't yours. Oh, they're just animals. They're just pets. Let's worry about human beings. Okay, if you're going to worry about human beings and how we treat children, if we're going to worry about abuse and sexual abuse and all the rest of it, excuse me, everybody, it's the same people and the same mentality. And you can't separate the two. And I think that's a big point you make in your book, and I want you to go there.
Yeah, I mean, so many of our Eastern and Western traditions' greatest philosophers and saints and sacred people have made this point, that the way we treat the least among us, I'll put that in scare quotes, least among us, because that's not a very enlightened way to refer to animals, but those who have the least power, who are the most vulnerable to our violent tendencies, the way we treat them really has ripple effects. And I read a lot of Buddhist philosophy and theology, and I think one of the reasons it appeals to me so much is the very prominent thread there of compassion, and that compassion it's not like compartmentalized, like you can have compassion for X kind of being or X kind of people, and not everybody else. It's a generalized sensibility or intentionality, and a kind of gentleness and nonviolence toward living things. So I do think that we have no hope of being good to each other if we can't be good to other creatures. And dogs are, I mean, in a way, they can be our greatest teachers, because we have, many of us with a dog, a relationship that is built on empathy, and we have compassion for them. And I think there are also a lot of things that we do to them or with them that aren't very compassionate. So using them as a way to become more mindful of how we behave, that can then spread out to how we behave toward others. And to use a personal example from my interactions with Bella, she's been a great teacher. She's my current dog companion. She's the main character in Who's a Good Dog. And the reason for the title is that Bella does not fit society's definition of a good dog. She's cranky and she bites people, including me. And wants to be left alone as much as she wants to interact, and doesn't want to obey human commands and so forth. And she has really invited me to think more carefully about what it means to interact with another being. And that, I had this whole set of expectations about what a good dog is, and she just blew that out of the water. And she's a good dog. Every dog is a good dog. That's the thing. And we just have to, it's our own perceptions and expectations of them that need to shift, so that we embrace who they are, not who we think they ought to be. And I think that goes for our interactions with other humans in our lives too. We have a lot of expectations about who we think people ought to be. And we need to love them for who they are.
Talk a little more about Who's a Good Dog. It's coming out in September.
Yes.
And is it also a University of Chicago book?
It is.
And when you get to that subtitle, How to Be a Better Human, talk about that part a little bit.
So it's really a deep dive into, so putting aside the questions that motivated Run Spot Run about, should we be buying dogs at all? Should we be breeding? How do you acquire a dog ethically? Just zeroing in on setting those aside and zeroing in on our personal relationship with the dog in our life. How can we make that as ethical and mindful as possible? And so, how do you give a dog a good life within the structural constraints of pet keeping practices that really restrict how we can interact with them? For example, if you, on the one hand, dogs need the freedom to run and be free and be off leash. And on the other hand, to be a good, responsible dog guardian, you can't do that. And so how do you navigate giving your dog enough freedom while also keeping your dog safe? And how do you feed your dog? How do you go for a walk? I know people are conflicted about what the purpose of a dog walk is. Is it for exercise? Is it for, sniffing? Who's the authority? A lot of the book ended up being about dog training, which I think is one of the worst things that we do to dogs.
Yeah, I agree, by the way. Yeah.
Yeah. Which I think will probably make a lot of people angry. But I feel concerned about dogs in our contemporary society. The number of pet dogs is increasing more rapidly than the number of people. More people are having dogs than they are having children. And especially with COVID, dog keeping just intensified. And dogs are not doing well. Dogs have suffer from, massive levels of anxiety and depression and frustration and boredom. And that is manifest in behavioral problems. There's, an interesting study out of Japan that did a survey of pet owners, and 80% of people reported that their dog had behavioral problems, which that's really shocking to me. And if you look at the list of behavioral problems that people list, they're almost all of them normal dog behaviors that people somehow have decided are unacceptable or annoying or whatever. So I think we need to find better ways to live with dogs. And I don't think there's a perfect way. That's why it's How to Be a Better Human, because we're all imperfect, and there are a lot of ways we can all be doing better than we are for the critters that we love so much.
I think there's another parallel too when you're talking about that. I have 5 grandchildren and 2 of them are grown up. In fact, I'm going to my oldest grandson's wedding in France this summer. He married a French girl he met in college and in university in Holland, where he went to school. But my three youngest grandchildren live across the street, and they're 14, 12, and 9. And my wife, Jeannie, and I have been doing the childcare for them. And as I look back on the difference between the quality of childcare and the mindfulness that I have and the wisdom and knowledge, if I may say so, as a 71-year-old, 70-year-old, compared to my own kids as a teen father, if you could just get back a little of that. Thank God I have a good relationship with them because they're good forgivers and they know that I was a kid myself raising kids. But I think there's a parallel because, of course, discipline of children and training of dogs and not accepting people for who they are. Once again, no, it's not just dogs. It's a whole mentality that says we're in a country that doesn't give paid paternity leave and doesn't say, go home and take care of your kids. You've had a child, stay home with that child for a while. We'll mind the store for your career. You can come back without missing a beat. In fact, we'll pay you to be with your child, to be a dad. I didn't say a mom, I said a dad. We've got everything wrong on that front too. So we have our kids as if they are hobbies and pets. Yeah. And, get 3 weeks or so at home and mom's going back to 2-day jobs while they're still bleeding from a C-section. I mean, give me a break. This is an inhumane, mean, anti-family, anti-pet, anti-everything living culture, period. And that's where my head is at. And, I'm an old guy trying to do better and say to people, the happiest days of my life have been caring for these little grandchildren, but doing it right and not disciplining all the time, but trying to open creative doors for them. I feel the same way about Zip. And I'm not saying it's perfect, but I do know it works better. And I think your thesis is not just about dogs, it's about existence. Yeah. And I'd like you to go there a little bit.
Yeah. I mean, what I think about is the parallel with, we outsource a lot of our childcare. You send your kid to camp and you send your kid to the music teacher and you send your kid to after school programs, all the while you're at work trying to make enough money to pay for the outsourcing of all of these things that you're told your child needs in order to get into Harvard. We outsource our dog care too. And I think we do that with trainers more than anywhere else. And I think the reason is that people feel like they don't have the expertise that they need to train their dog. And I would say, yes, you do. The expertise you need is to spend the day with your dog. Don't outsource it. Figure out who your dog is, how you can collaborate together to create a messy but mutually happy living. And I think people think of training as this like a project or an add-on. And if you're a good dog owner, you'll do 15 minutes of training a day. And when you have a puppy, you'll follow the training book and your dog will know a list of 20 commands and be perfectly obedient to you at all times. And it's this whole mindset of like your dog is a robot and you program it to respond to cues instead of seeing your dog as a living person with his or her own ideas about what's enjoyable and what they want to do, which they should have, and collaborating together. And one of the phrases that I use in the book that I borrowed from a veterinarian named Karen Overall is negotiated settlements. I mean, that it's messy living with a dog as with a child. And instead of trying to force our will on another being, we need to understand who they are as much as we can from our own private subjective world, and be compassionate about what they need and collaborate to do the best we can together.
I can't wait to read Who's a Good Dog. Please come back in September.
I will.
And get me an advance copy. I just
Sure.
want to say, everybody, we're going to, when this podcast goes up, we always link to anything you want to have us link to. Ernie, our redoubtable producer, creator, my best friend on in so many areas of life, anyway, will make sure that happens. What would you like us to do about pushing your work out there? I mean, everybody's got to read your, Run, Spot, Run, but they've also got to read your new book, Who's a Good Dog? How do you want to connect with people who might hear this? What should we do about following you and connecting with you? And we'll put all the links up. I don't need you don't need to spell anything out. I'm just saying, What do you want us to do?
Well, you could link people to my website, because that will help them find everything that I've written. And then, people can see, oh, I'm interested in end of life care, so they can kind of pick and choose. I have a blog on Psychology Today website called All Dogs Go to Heaven, which I
love, by the way. I read it.
Oh, thank you. I'm an atheist too, though, by the way. So
yeah,
heaven.
But I mean, my book, like I said, I have a book, Why I'm an Atheist Who Believes in God, but I'm still praying for Zip, even if no one's hearing me. Maybe you're hearing me.
I love your title, and I would describe myself in the exact same way. We can have another conversation about what that means. So website, Psychology Today blog, and like my contact info is on my website, and links to books, and that should be a good central repository.
So besides the new book coming up, just before we wrap up, and then we'll be done, what are you up to in terms of just fielding questions about all this, dealing with people who must react fiercely? When you say shut down the kennel clubs and no more dog shows, and you're out there, you probably hear from people, but how do you prioritize in terms of answering that, but also just your interest in childcare and psychology and all these other things? You have a lot of stuff going. Just talk personally for a minute, how that all balances out with your own personal life and sanity and all the rest.
So I actually, in terms of hate mail, I don't really get much, because for better or for worse, to use a religious metaphor, I'm preaching to the choir. I think the people who read my writing are generally people who have questions along the same lines, or discomfort along the same lines. So I don't think that the head of the American Kennel Club is reading my blog. He should, or she should be, but I don't think they'd like it very much. And my daughter's 25, so my direct child care responsibilities have eased up a lot. And I only have one pet, Bella. So my animal caregiving responsibilities are really focused on her. And in terms of keeping my sanity, I don't know that I do, but I try to spend as much time as I can. I using the Japanese phrase, forest bathing.
Yes.
I go out on the trails and run and mountain bike and climb and do outside stuff and play in my, I wouldn't call it a garden because it's pretty wild, but just hang out with Bella. We go down to the lake down the street and play ball, because she can't really walk well, but she loves to swim.
Well, Run, Spot, Run is an incredible book. I recommend it beyond recommendation. It's wonderful. I think it's groundbreaking. I think it'll be remembered as they'll be saying, if nothing changes, you will redeem our moment. And they'll say, yeah, but there were some people who spoke up.
Oh, well, thank you.
They weren't all bad. There was somebody called Jessica Pierce, and she did stand up for what was right.
But everybody ignored.
Yeah, she was 150 years early, but eventually everybody got there, and she started it. I mean, I really admire you greatly. I really admire you. And I think you're such an important voice. So I just don't know what to say except that. Thank you for writing such a good book and being human in it. And I really can't wait to read Who's a Good Dog. Do me a personal favor, get me an advance copy at the earliest possible date. You have my contact through Ernie, our wonderful producer. We're going to be back talking about your new book. And thank you so much for this time together. I hope you enjoyed the conversation.
Yeah, thank you, Frank, for having me. It was really a pleasure to talk to you.
Yeah, me too. 100%. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Until next time, Jessica.
All right. Goodbye.
Thank you.